You're listening to The Weather Junkies.
Oh boy. Large wedge tornado coming up into Tuscaloosa.
A winter storm warning is in effect for our area.
So we can expect at least another 2 to 4 inches overnight. Then that snow
The National Weather Service in Huntsville has issued a tornado warning for northwestern Massachusetts.
14 to 22 inches of snow!
Good Thursday evening, and thank you for joining us here on the Weather Junkies. It's great to be back here in 2017, the first show of the new year, and we have a special guest joining us, David Coyle, and Dakota Smith is also on the show. Dakota?
Hey, everybody. Good to be back after our 3 weeks of break, and it's a cold, snowy day in Colorado. We got about 4 to 8 inches across the Front Range, and I spent a good portion of the day outside enjoying that. Also, a new mic. Got a new mic here. Santa was very nice to me, and got a weather station actually for the backyard. So all sorts of gadgets to help the show and to poke at curiosity. Tyler, how's the weather in the East Coast?
It is, I just ran outside. I want to say it's cold, and I guess it will be cold this weekend. Temperatures in the 20s, so that's below average, but we don't have any snow on the ground, and the grass still has a green tint to it, so I'd say we've been pretty near average in the last couple of weeks and moving forward. We have 2 little snow threats, one tomorrow, one on Saturday, but they're both like a fluffy 1 to 3 inches. So winter really hasn't kicked into gear from a snow standpoint yet.
Yeah, I know you like snow and like going to ski on that, so hopefully you get some snow here. We're joined tonight by Dr. David Coyle, who's actually out of Atlanta, and they're experiencing, or will at least this weekend, some snow. How's the weather down there, Dave?
You know, it's pretty good. I'm in Athens at the University of Georgia, and right now it's around 50 degrees, but we do have a winter storm warning, and you may remember a couple of years ago there was a snowpocalypse incident that happened that made pretty big news in Atlanta. So I think everyone's trying to avoid that. There's been all sorts of warnings that things may cancel. Just be aware. Odds are we'll get maybe an inch of snow tops, but that's kind of all it takes down here. So
yeah,
to be continued.
Yeah, I know what that's like. I used to live in Maryland, and yep, an inch is all it takes.
Yep.
So you got your bachelor's in biology, then you wanted to get your master's in entomology and forestry at Iowa, and then a PhD in entomology from Wisconsin. And right now you run the Regional Forest Health and Invasive Species Program called the Southern Regional Extension Forestry. So we're really excited to chat with you about that. Just kind of a brief, what exactly do you do in your position right now?
Well, I work for the whole southeastern region, so that's sort of defined by the Forest Service's regions. It's 13 states. The borders are Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kentucky, Virginia, and everything kind of below that. And I work with mostly the state forestry agencies and the university, like the county extension folks. And I make sure they have the information they need because they're the ones that take the questions from the people that actually own the land. So when, John Smith calls them and says, hey, I've got 50 acres of pine trees dying, what's happening? I'm the one that makes sure that those people know what is happening and know what to say and what to do and that type of thing. So it's a pretty involved program. It gets me across the whole southeastern region, and there's online components to it. There's in-person components, a lot of time on the phone, that type of thing.
Gotcha. And you guys have a really nice website, southernforesthealth.net. So if you're interested and you're listening right now, check that out. We'll be talking about some of the stuff on the site. And before we talk about forest health and how weather impacts it, Tyler and I are going to go into a few tweets here. Dave, chime in if you want. The first tweet here is from Jen DeHart at JCD DeHart. She says, weather Twitter. I've started a map of places to eat, grab coffee, drink at AMS. It's not done, but send me feedback. You can find this tweet on our site or on our Twitter. We'll retweet it. But I'm looking. The reason I chose this one is I'm really looking forward to the annual Meteorological Society meeting in Seattle, which is in just I think a week and a half. It's going to start January 20th is when I'm going out. So maybe it's closer to 2 weeks. But really looking forward to that. Tyler, I don't think you're coming out there, but you've been to AMS before. What do you think about AMS?
I think it's a great gathering of meteorological minds. I went in Atlanta, which was a couple years ago, and at that time I was still in school, just like you were at Penn State. So it was kind of cool to meet other people from other schools and go to the talks that were interesting to me. I mean, at AMS, there's so many, so you can, well, first of all, you can't go at all of them, number one, but that's good because you're probably not going to like all of them. So you can choose the ones you want to go to and get a good sampling. And so it's in Seattle. Are you going?
Yeah, I will be. Really looking forward to it. I actually have been to Seattle. They had it in Seattle, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago. And that was the first AMS I went to. And I only went for like 2 days. So I'm really looking forward to actually experiencing Seattle this time around.
I was just on the West Coast, but it was not Seattle weather. It was Pasadena weather.
I'm assuming you're referring to the Rose Bowl, huh?
Yes, it was a great time.
Yeah, looked like the weather was nice.
It was. There was a lot of clouds, but it was, I guess, typical, like 50s to near 60, nothing going on.
Yeah, well, I won't go into the Rose Bowl too much because I might start crying. So let's move on to our next tweet here. I picked the tweets this week, so this is my last one actually. This one is from Mitchell Byars. He's a journalist in Boulder, Colorado, 30 minutes from where I live. And his tweet says, hashtag Boulder sends out full fleet of 17 snowplows after light snowfall due to new city policy. So basically, my take on this is that Boulder, the city of Boulder, doesn't trust the forecast enough to send out proportionate amounts of snowplows based on the inch amount of that's forecasted. So basically, whenever there's snow in the forecast, they send the entire fleet out. This is a reaction to an overachieving storm last year. I think it was forecast a few inches, and they ended up with over a foot, and it caused all sorts of chaos last year. So it boggles my mind that forecasting in Colorado is at this point where the city of Boulder doesn't trust their meteorologists, and they just go all out with the snowplows, and disregarding the actual forecast. It just says snow. Tyler, I don't know if you have an opinion on this or not, but I don't know. It kind of.
Well, I've never been to Colorado before, but my perception of it is that things can change quickly in very unexpected ways. That happens here, but not. It seems to me that the magnitude of those changes may be greater and more frequent out there. I don't know. You've lived out there for a while. Is that the case?
It's not so. I mean, things change fast, but I think that can happen almost anywhere. I think the bigger problem here is that our weather models don't handle this area that well, and that's relative, to other, like the East Coast, where it's East Coast or the plains. It has to. To me, it has to do with the mountains, right? We got 10,000 foot mountains right next to us, and models don't really handle them that well. And so if you have an inch forecast, and then you never really know. Whenever I see a weather forecast out here for snowfall, this is especially for snowfall, I think. I kind of I sort of disregard it. I mean, I know that there's going to be snow, but I never really know how much it's going to be. And I don't know. If it's a blockbuster storm, they handle it pretty well. But if it's like a 2 to 3 incher, 4 to 5 incher, you never really know. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, we have the same thing down here, after that big incident in 2014, it made the national news. It made Atlanta look really, really bad, unprepared and all that. we had a couple pretty minor storms last year, and all of a sudden the, I guess, proactive reaction was over the top. It was maybe a possibility of freezing rain. Everything got canceled. Schools, daycare, you name it. It's like they were so concerned about looking bad again or looking ill-prepared again, they just went overboard. And that sounds like the situation you're in out there too.
Yeah, I guess it is better to be safe than sorry. So
Before we move on, there was a big conversation on Twitter in the last couple days about improving conversations and improving the weather sphere. Did you see that, Dakota?
okay, so Tyler, you actually you're traveling right now, so you can't see the rundown here, but that's actually my read of the week.
Okay.
Yeah, so the read of the week this week is from Brian Wood. He wrote on Medium. The title of his piece was "On the Predictability of Snow Map Insanity." And if for people who aren't aware of what this is about, basically whenever there's a big snowstorm or not a big snowstorm on the horizon, but a weather model picks up on it, people start sharing these snow maps that have forecasts that can sometimes be crazy and really far into the future. So there's this conversation right now in the weather community about how do we control kind of what's getting out to the public. How do we make sure that it's good information getting out there, and so he goes through kind of a process of dealing with this, and I'll summarize it in a few minutes here. The first thing he says is this is not going away. This problem's not going away. We're going to have people sharing snow maps forever, basically. And so we just have to deal with it. So, and he goes on to say that it's not just amateur meteorologists. There are legit meteorologists doing it, who are degreed on air, and they're sharing these maps too. And he says, we shouldn't feed the trolls when it comes to these snow maps. We shouldn't comment kind of snarkily or insult them, or we should engage with them in a productive conversation about the ramifications of sharing this, and maybe try to, I don't know, privately message them and talk with them about it. And finally, he says that the job of meteorologists is to explain the weather. So it's not just sharing snow maps and sharing model output. It's to kind of explain and share with the public what the weather is. Tyler, how do you deal with when you get snow map shared in your area and you might get a response from one of your viewers about it? How do you deal with that?
This year we haven't had a lot of it yet, but I would say my biggest thing that I've been focusing on in a lot of different things in the last couple of weeks, and probably it's because football season just ended, control what you can control. And I can't control what other people are posting. And you said at the top of that story said it's not going to change, and that's absolutely correct. I mean, it's just not going to change. So I'm not going to waste time and waste energy and get all upset about something that I have no control over. With that said, I think it's very important to maintain communication as soon as possible. As soon as possible, with the right bits of information getting out when you see a storm on the map. So I think we discussed this probably a year ago in the middle of winter, and I think I still have the same opinion that you have to maintain that presence, and you have to build up the trust and build up the respect. And then if someone comments on something you post and says, hey, I saw something that's twice the amount over here, then I think you just say, well, there's a lot of weather sources. You have to know what you're looking at, and you have to find trusted sources, and sometimes you have to be a little pushy.
Yeah.
But it's a really bad problem. I haven't seen it yet personally this year, but it's a really bad problem, and I think probably eventually people are going to realize that everything is wrong all the time. They've got to go back to their roots and look at look at who the accurate weather sources are, the National Weather Service, local meteorologists, and stuff like that. I mean, you can only put out so many foot-plus forecasts and have them bust before you start looking elsewhere, I would think. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I say I don't know because 60,000 people watch a live video on Facebook of a still image that's not even worth looking at. So,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But
we
I
could
don't get too worried.
Yeah, so we could go on about this forever, and maybe we'll dedicate a full episode to it. But we got to get to our main topic right now, and that is forest health, particularly in the southeast. So Dave, you run this awesome website, you run this awesome program that does a lot of outreach. I guess, how did you kind of end up in this position? What led you to study insects and then eventually into your position right now?
Man, that's getting back there. I guess, what led me to study insects, that started when it's your quintessential feel-good story. I was a little kid, grew up in the woods, and, the nearest neighbor was a quarter mile away, which is a fairly hefty bike ride on a little BMX bike. So I spent a lot of time just, in nature, started collecting insects, got into 4-H, and my mom and dad helped me take a bug collection to the fair along with a cow because, you're on a farm, so you take a cow. And, it just sort of blossomed. I really liked insects. I liked raising the caterpillars and all that type of thing. Took a little hiatus in high school, and then when I got to college at Luther, my advisor just happened to be an entomologist they just hired. And so that was, he sort of nurtured that love I had and took his entomology class. And then it got to the point where when I was ready to graduate, I guess I went in thinking, man, if I get a bachelor's degree in biology, I can have this awesome job training flipper or whatever. But it turns out you can't do a whole lot with a bachelor's in biology. So I made the choice to go to grad school, in all honesty, just to sort of put off being an adult. It was that or get a job. So I chose more school and started grad school at Iowa State, and that was in entomology and forestry. So I did a lot of work with pest management and this intensively managed poplars. We grow them for biofuel and really fast rotation. So you get a mature tree in, 15 years and then cut it down and start over, sort of like growing trees in an agricultural way. But I liked grad school and I liked research and I liked what I did, and it just sort of took off from there. I got a job, I worked for a while, then I went back to get my PhD, and then that led me down here to Georgia.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can relate to that. I loved insects when I was a kid. But I still have, somewhat of an interest. And out in Colorado, we have the mountain pine beetle.
Yes,
and
you do.
Yeah, and so I've been studying that a little bit, just kind of in my free time. I was wondering if you could explain maybe the problem that pine beetles pose to forests.
Yeah, so there's kind of two types of pine beetles. There's a genus called Dendroctonus, and that includes your mountain pine beetle and your southern pine beetle, which is sort of the eastern equivalent of the mountain pine beetle. And then there's a group called, the genus is Ips. So they're all bark beetles. Dendroctonus species are the kind that can actually attack and kill a live, healthy tree when their populations get big enough. So the problem is, whether it's in the southeast or in the west, trees are pretty good at defending themselves. They've got, all that tree sap that gets all over you when you're cutting wood. Well, that's what happens whenever a beetle tries to bore into a tree. It tries to chew its way in there. If the tree is healthy, it's going to immediately kick out a bunch of sap in that hole. And most of the time, that beetle's going to just get covered in sap and entombed in sap. And, if you go there later, you'll often see a little sap, chunk of sap there. We call it a pitch tube. And you'll see a dead beetle in there because the tree basically won that attack. But when certain conditions happen, it all relates to tree stress. When trees get stressed from one thing or another, they get weak, they can't produce enough sap, and then when beetles try to attack them, they are successful. Maybe not all of them at first, but some of them, and then a few more come, and they gradually more and more come, and all of a sudden you've got a tree that's dying and it's full of beetles. And then it's sort of like the populations of these insects increase exponentially, 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8 type thing. And that's how we get outbreaks. And, once an outbreak gets going from some of these Dendroctonus species, there's not a lot we can do to stop it. It's just nature's kind of got to take its course. Now it's a little different in the southeast with our southern pine beetle. We can stop it with some management techniques, but boy, out west, I mean, you've probably seen the millions of acres of devastation, just dead trees all over the place because there's not a lot you can do.
Yeah, so it seems like this hasn't been a problem until recently. Why is that?
Oh man, there's a lot of reasons. I think, as far as the mountain pine beetle, so much land in the West, so much forest land is publicly owned, right, by the Forest Service, Department of the Interior, etc. And there's just not enough, basically, money to go around to make sure all those stands are managed how they should be. And when I say managed stand, trees can get too thick. If you've got a bunch of trees that grow and grow and grow, there's only so many resources in that parcel of land. If you get too much tree on there, there's not enough water, not enough nutrients, and then the trees get stressed. That's why we always say, especially down here in the southeast, when there gets to be a certain amount of tree biomass on a stand, you have to thin it. You have to take some of the trees out, because then that allows the remaining trees to have more access to water, more access to nutrients. So part of the problem out west is that there's just not been enough management. The other part is it's getting warmer. I mean, climate change is happening, and that is really contributing to some of these beetle populations in a number of ways. Whereas before, beetles could only get to a certain elevation and it would get too cold, right? As it gets warmer, beetles can go higher. And as they go higher, they're now encountering new trees, either individuals or all new species that they hadn't encountered before. And all of a sudden, they've got this buffet of new things they've not eaten that's now available to them that wasn't, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Gotcha. And on like a day-to-day, month-to-month weather basis, how does the weather impact how these beetles operate and how they, I guess, harm trees?
Right. The weather impacts sort of two sides of the equation. So the weather impacts the beetles. Beetles are cold-blooded, so they develop at a certain rate based on the temperature. So the warmer it is, the faster they're going to develop. And as it gets warmer, they may go from 4 generations a year, from egg to larva to pupa to adult. It may go from 4 generations to 5 generations. It may go from 5 to 6. So you've got more beetles on the landscape when it gets warmer. The increased temperature also impacts the trees. Everything's fine in moderation. Trees can handle it getting a little warmer from time to time. But when it gets continually warmer and continually drier, that's the key there, it gets continually drier, these trees are more and more and more stressed. And the trees basically have to make a choice. Am I going to use the energy I have to grow and reproduce, or am I going to use this energy to try to defend myself if and when beetles attack? So you've sort of got, as it gets warmer, as it gets drier, trees are more stressed. There's more generations of beetles, and the beetles are getting to places they haven't been before, and it all sort of swirls together in the perfect storm, so to speak.
So kind of backing out a little bit in terms of tree health, what are some of the ways that weather impacts tree health?
Well, trees, so trees are unique in that they live a long time in the same place. So, it may be we may have a wet year, we may have a dry year, and that means something very different to people growing something like corn, right? You can get through a wet year, okay, you just kind of start over the next year. For trees, all of these things sort of add up. And I think the best analogy I can say is think of it as a person. Let's say in some years you get to eat all you want, and some years you only get to eat half of what you want. that's going to have an overall effect on how you grow through your whole lifespan. If you've got a tree that has had great conditions its whole life versus a tree that has had good conditions in maybe 5 out of 10 years, the other 5 years it's super dry, maybe a couple of years it's super wet, that's not good either. That all adds up, and that all sort of reduces the health of the tree, can reduce the lifespan of the tree. So it's just, there's a lot of things that add up over the course of a tree's lifetime, and a lot of that is weather, both good and both bad.
So when it comes to drought, what I guess they can probably handle a short drought, but if there's like a longer drought, do forests normally do okay in that, or what kind of happens there?
Yeah, there's a lot of differences based on what kind of tree you're talking about. There's some pines in the southeast that have very, very long tap roots. So longleaf pine is one of them. It grows a really, really deep taproot, and it's adapted to living in sandy soils. It can handle those droughts a bit more because those taproots can reach down 25, 30 feet and tap into some of that deeper water. Whereas our common tree, loblolly pine, the taproot doesn't go that deep, and it's much more drought susceptible. So you might have a loblolly and a longleaf growing side by side. You get a drought happening, and you'll see, sickness or maybe even death in the loblolly, but not the longleaf, all based on how that tree is growing, morphologically. One can reach water and one can't. You're right, short droughts usually aren't too bad. Trees can usually put up with them, and that depends on where they're growing, how old they are, that type of thing. But the long droughts are what really get us, and the long, and it's not just the lack of rain, it's especially in the southeast, it's the temperature, lack of rain, and the wind. Because if you've got, maybe no rain for a month, but the temperature's mild, that's having a lot less impact on a tree than no rain for a month, 105 degrees and windy. Because that's just like turning a dryer on the whole time.
An extreme drought that started in May 2015. So it'll be 2 years in May. So it'll be interesting to see if we start to see some impacts from that, because the foliage in the last 2 years has been fine, maybe above average, but even things like ski area snowmaking ponds are empty in some cases. So we're definitely seeing some of the longer term impacts in terms of water here in Connecticut already.
Yeah, and hardwood trees can usually, they sort of say hardwoods have 2 to 4 years in them where they can handle bad conditions because they've got so much energy stored in their roots. So even though it's dry, they're still putting out that good crown. They're tapping into their root energy and their stored stuff. But if you're going on year 2, going on year 3, it will be interesting to see. Some of those trees aren't going to have enough to keep them going for a third year in a drought situation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens up there. And you guys in the Northeast have had some wicked caterpillar outbreaks lately. Gypsy moth, and there was another one it escapes my mind, but you've had some crazy caterpillar outbreaks up there too. And that's just another factor. These trees are using their reserves to make leaves, and then all of a sudden the leaves get eaten. So then if it's, then they use their reserves again to try to make more leaves, and it's just really tapping what they've got. So at some point there's gonna be nothing left to call on.
One thing I find interesting about this conversation is that we're kind of talking about plants and trees as these things that can make decisions about where to put their energy. And I actually learned that kind of, I don't know, I guess I heard that kind of thinking in one of my ecology classes, and I heard this story about trees in northern Colorado. I have no idea what type of tree, but it's a deciduous tree, presumably. And I guess when hailstorms come around, if the hail's bad enough, it'll take out all the leaves, and then the tree will grow back the leaves, depending on what time of year, if it's in the beginning of the summer or late spring. But then if it happens again, the tree just doesn't come back. I was wondering if you could kind of shed some light on maybe why it does that.
Well, getting back to the decision thing, a tree has a certain amount of time to make food. So what a tree does with its leaves all summer is make food to grow and to store in the roots and to protect itself. Those are the three things it uses, the photosynthate for. So let's back up and let's say the tree has had its leaves until August and then that hailstorm hits. Well, it's not, from a tree's perspective, it's not worth putting all new leaves on, because that's probably going to take you a couple weeks. You've put all this energy into new leaves that are just going to fall off in another month, right? So you're not going to gain. You've got very little bang for your buck at that point. On the flip side, if the tree has maybe just leafed out and it's May, and then that hailstorm hits, there's still 3-4 solid months of energy making left. So in that case, it's worth it for that tree to use those stored carbohydrates and stored energy, put out that new flush of leaves, because you'll still come out positive in the end as far as how much energy you can make, maybe do some growth and be able to protect yourself too. So it's just really, and how do trees know when to do that? That's an awesome question. I do not know. But, from a tree fizz standpoint, that's, the choice, so to speak, is it worth your time and effort to put this new leaves out before they're going to fall off because of cold anyway?
Yeah, this reminds me of like money and investments for people. Like, are you going to end up positive, or is the investment not worth it?
That's exactly what it is. It's an investment, and even within a healthy tree, sometimes you'll see healthy trees dropping leaves, and they're usually dropping leaves that are at the bottom or kind of deep in the canopy. It's because the energy it takes the tree to keep that leaf alive is not being recouped by that leaf as far as the energy that leaf is producing. So as soon as that sort of scale tips to this leaf is now a full-time cost, the tree sheds it. Does the same for branches. If this branch is not pulling its weight, basically, it'll just start shutting it off, and tree will self-prune.
So one weather event, particularly in the southeast, that impacts forests are ice storms. And we were talking before the show, and you were telling me about the ice belt, which I actually didn't know was a thing. I was wondering if you could explain the ice belt, its impact on forests, and why we should be thinking about it in the future.
Yeah, I think it's more of an unofficial anecdotal thing.
Gotcha.
But most foresters down here do sort of acknowledge that it exists. And very roughly, it extends from sort of the middle of Georgia, and then sort of make a U up. So it sort of follows the coastline of the Carolinas, and then kind of goes into Alabama and Mississippi. Basically, it's 2 to 3 hours off the coast, if that makes sense. So it's this line, in the southeast, we've got the Appalachians, which gives us a little elevation and a little cooler temperatures, and then it gets very flat down towards the ocean. Well, once you get to that flat part of the coastal plain, it doesn't usually get that cold, on the average. We do get snow pretty much every year in the foothills of the Appalachians, and so then there's that region between where it's going to snow kind of every year, and it's probably not going to snow. There's that region that's prone and susceptible to getting these ice storms. And, in addition to wreaking havoc on everyone who lives there, because nobody knows how to drive in ice, this ice collects on these trees, especially the pines, because the pines have all their needles on. They're basically just big ice magnets, right? The needles get full of rain, it freezes, they get super heavy, and then the branches and or trunks of trees just snap. And, a couple of years ago, there was a really bad ice storm around Augusta, Georgia, where they have the Masters golf tournament. And acres and acres and acres of trees just got, snapped in half. You drive down and 60% of the trees in a stand would be just bent over and broken. So it's a really big, economic loss for these people that have these stands. And so one thing that we're thinking is, as it gets warmer, that quote unquote ice belt is going to shift to the north. And all of a sudden, people that own land and people that farm trees in areas that never really dealt with ice before are going to find themselves dealing with ice storms. And so that's something that, we need to try to educate them on, figure out what we can do from a management perspective, try to figure out, if we can, how far is it going to go, because the ice belt is sort of this nebulous thing. It's a little trickier, but at the same time, we know it's probably not going to go south. It's not going to start getting colder all of a sudden and shift it south. It's going to keep warming. So that area that is more prone to those ice storms is going to shift north. So that's, and because trees are, in the ground 25, 30, 35 years, stuff that's planted now could easily be in line for ice storms in the next decade or so.
That's interesting, and one of the big takeaways I take from that is the people who are living there might not be ready for that type of weather event. I mean, ice storms can happen anywhere almost, especially in the United States, but not as frequently. There's a kind of things that you're ready for and things that happen every now and then that you don't really aren't ready for. You mentioned we talked about the pine beetle and how a warming climate can impact them, and then we talked about the ice belt and how a warming climate can impact that. What are some other things in the Southeast that a warming climate might do to forest health?
Well, not just, I'll come back to the warming climate, but the thing we deal with down here is more the climate unpredictability, because we get the hurricanes down here quite a bit too. And we see a lot of damage from hurricanes. Those are pretty unpredictable, as you know. I mean, they're predictable on sort of a short time scale, but, you can't say next year what's going to happen hurricane-wise. But that's something we're always watching. And every time a hurricane comes through, we're always kind of looking to see what the damage will be. And we had a lot of flooding last year, too, especially in the Carolinas. And that's one of those things that we're still waiting to see what impacts will come from the flooding. It's something we just don't know yet. Getting back to the warming, like I said, a little warming is fine. Trees can handle it. And a little warming is fine if it's going to rain. That's okay too, because that's just going to make these trees grow faster. All these people that are growing them for economic purposes are going to see some great gains. People that just have trees, as part of, some nature land, it's going to be fine. The key is it gets warmer and it doesn't rain, and we had, as everybody saw, really bad fires in the Southeast this year. Gatlinburg was the big one that got a lot of the publicity because, some people lost their lives and structures were damaged, but there were fires burning all over the Southeast this year. And that's partially because, it didn't rain down here for over 2 months over a big chunk of the Southeast. There's a lot of places that had, I guess, rainless streaks broken, 60, 70 days of no measurable rain, and then maybe they got 1/100th of an inch, which, if there's a fire going, could just as well be nothing as well. So, a big part of what happened there is a lot of those places that burned were in the mountains, and they were mostly hardwood stands. Hardwood stands don't usually burn as well because of the nature of hardwood leaf litter. So this is something I hadn't thought about till recently, but pine needles drop and they're very airy and air can get through them and they dry out and they become flammable tinder quite quickly. But hardwood leaves, oak leaves, birch leaves, all that stuff, they fall down and they sort of lay on each other and trap water in there. And if you go to a hardwood forest and grab a handful of leaf litter, it's almost always moist. Well, that prevents a lot of the fires. I mean, that's not something that's going to readily burn. But when it hasn't rained for 2.5 months, all of a sudden, all that leaf litter is dry and flammable. And, I think that's partially what contributed to the spread of some of these fires this year in areas that didn't normally get burned. It said it was so dry for so long that all of a sudden everything was flammable. And some of the fires were obviously accidental, some were not. But the fact is, because it was so dry, everything was ready to burn, even in areas that normally wouldn't.
Do you think that we have a good enough, I don't know, but do you think we have a good enough idea of like what the fire danger is in certain areas? Because I feel like on a kind of like a short-term scale, the people in Gatlinburg were definitely not ready for something like that.
Yes and no, I guess would be my answer. I think, so I think there's two things. There's having an idea of the fire danger, and then there's getting the people that live in those areas to accept that risk, that level of fire danger. I think that's two
Right.
different things, So
Yeah.
I think the scientists and all the fire scientists and foresters, I think we've got a pretty good handle on what is and isn't flammable, what's dangerous, what's not dangerous. The key, and maybe the part we're missing, is educating the public on those same things. Urban forest encroachment is sort of your classic tale of this. You can tell people all you want in whether it's Gatlinburg or whether it's Montana or Colorado or Northern California, hey, if you build a house in the middle of the woods, that's the middle of this flammable area, just so you know. Most people aren't, going to care. They're going to do it anyway because everyone wants a house in the woods. So do I think we know the risks? Yeah, I think we do. But I think people either maybe they don't care enough. Maybe they're just willing to live with the risks, to have kind of what they want and the land they want.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of living in like a floodplain. Depending on what kind of river you're next to, it's like what are the odds? How frequent are those type of events? Some people are really willing to take that risk. Some aren't, and still buy it and get the insurance, which is always a way to go. But then you have other people. Yeah, it's hard to find a place to live where you don't have a risk like that, because can't live in the woods, can't live in a floodplain.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's risk everywhere, right? So
yeah,
everyone's
right.
got to sort of decide what's important to them. And in the case of the fires in the Appalachians this year, under normal circumstances, those fires aren't going to spread as fast and as far as they did. They really did hit the perfect storm. It was super dry, so it dried out areas of leaf litter that normally weren't dry. It was super hot and it was super windy. And that all happened at the same time, and it just, boom, stuff exploded. And you take away any one of those and we probably don't have this conversation. Maybe it's not windy. Well, dry and hot, that's, it's different if it's not windy, but those fires were moving. One big rain could have stopped it. If that leaf litter was a bit moister, if we'd had some rains to keep the ground a little more wet and the leaf litter a little more wet, the fire wouldn't have spread that fast. So it really was one of those things where it all just sort of came together in the perfect storm, and boom, you've got this raging fire going everywhere. I'm sure everyone that lived in Gatlinburg, obviously they knew they lived in a beautiful wooded place that could theoretically burn, but how often does a hardwood stand burn? Not very. So I mean, I understand where they thought their risk was low, and under a normal circumstance it is low living in a hardwood stand. So it was just one of those things that nature caught up to us this year.
So to wrap up the show here, we're going to ask you a question that we ask everyone that comes on the show, and that is, what advice would you give to an up-and-coming forest scientist or entomologist, or maybe someone who's just an undergrad trying to get through some of those hard bio classes? What kind of advice would you give them?
I tell you what, the first thing I would tell them is to maintain a work-life balance. I think that's vastly underappreciated, especially in the sort of competitive academic world we're in now. It is so important to figure out what you like to do outside of work and keep doing that, even though you might be super busy with classes, with your research, whatever. I really think you got to find what it is you like to do and stick to it. I've been on both sides of that sort of deal, and I'm much more happy and much more productive with a work-life balance. It sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes the best thing you can do is take some time away from your work, do something else, and then come back to it. From a purely professional standpoint, I think we're in the age of you need to have something that sets you apart. So develop a skill. Maybe that's statistics. Maybe that's GIS. Maybe that's something else. But that's the type of thing that's going to help people get jobs and help people notice them, is this special skill they have that will set them apart from everyone else that might have, good grades or a good research project or something like that. Communication is super important. You guys are doing a great job with these podcasts. I think something that's been lost until recently is, we as science folks need to talk to the masses more. Maybe, especially in the current political climate, we need to really get the word out of what science is, what it does, how we can help people and what we do. And so I think communicating on many levels is so important, whether it's to your mom and dad, to your grandpa, to your neighbor, to your local politician. Knowing how to talk to people of varying backgrounds with varying jobs, so important, so important. And, finally, I would say don't be afraid to take chances. I took a fairly big chance in the realm I did. I turned down a permanent job, but because it wasn't at a place we really wanted to go as a family. Took a chance, and then this has been going real well. So you got to just sort of figure out what your priorities are in life and roll with them, and that usually all works out.
I really like that first bit of advice. Maintain a work-life balance. I don't think we've actually heard that on the show yet.
Really?
So yeah.
I'll tell you a little story. When I first met my my current wife, I was still a postdoc here, and it was coming up to Thanksgiving time. So there's a few days where there weren't classes, or the students were gone, yada yada, and we were walking the dog, and I said, "Man, I can't wait till next week when all the students are gone, because I can get so much work done." In an empty lab. And she looked at me incredulously and said, "What do you mean work? You're not taking those days off like everyone else?" And I think right there it dawned on me that that's maybe not normal. Like, you shouldn't have to work holidays.
Yeah.
And so it was really at that very point where I thought, man, she's right. This is ridiculous. So that changed it. It's been a good change too. And in the overall scheme of things, does it really matter if you work every holiday and publish one more paper a year? I don't know. Maybe not, but I don't know. I think you got to maintain that balance, man.
Yeah, I agree with you there. If you want to look at more of what Dave does, you can go to his outreach website, southernforesthealth.net. His research site is davidcoyle.uga.edu. He's on Twitter at Dr. Dave Coyle, Coyle. And then on Facebook, you can find him on facebook.com/Southern Forest Health. Dave, thanks so much for joining us. This was an awesome chat, and we haven't had an entomologist on the show yet, so we can check that one off the list.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Happy to be the checkoff. Anything I can do to help.
All right, thanks for joining us. And now to plug our sites, you can find us on Twitter at the Weather Junkies, the WX Junkies. We're on Facebook as well. You can listen to this podcast on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, and pretty much any podcast platform that you like. And you can find all the wrap up of the show and the actual show itself on our website, theweatherjunkies.com. Tyler, you want to sign us off here?
Yes, we're working on a guest for next week. As soon as we know, we'll let you know. There's a little bit of a complication, and that's that I'm moving 4.5 hours north of Connecticut late next week. So I want to say Thursday, but it probably won't be Thursday. But we'll let you know the guest and the time as soon as we have it. On behalf of Dakota, David, and myself, thank you so much for joining us for this very first episode of the new year. And we hope that you'll stick with us for many episodes to come. Have a great evening.